All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Martine Carcassonne. I'm a communication studies professor here at Colorado State University and the director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. This is a webinar put on by the Deliberative Journalism Project, which was a project put together starting last fall, a collaborative process between the CPD, the Journalism and Media Communication Department here at CSU, the Political Science Department here at CSU, the Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department at CSU, and then also kind of several local newsrooms, starting particularly with the Coloradan, but also FC Public Media, KUNC, and we hope to kind of go beyond that, and also the public library system here, the Poudre River Library District. The Deliberative Journalism Project is a large project just overall dedicated to working together to improve.
I think I will go ahead and fill in until we get Martine back. So basically, he was just describing the Deliberative Journalism Project, which, as he said, started almost a year ago now as a set of conversations between Martine and several people in the community, including the Coloradoan, the journalism department here at CSU, the political science department, and eventually the language, literatures, and cultures department here. From there, we started reaching out to other key community members all across Northern Colorado, as well as some important supporters in Denver to start having conversations about what deliberative journalism would look like. And I think I see Martine coming back. And so that also includes the local library here, and we'll hear from Anna Claire a little later, as well as FC Public Media and KUNC in Greeley. We've had a lot of support from the Colorado News Collaborative, the CoLab in general, just guidance and support there, and several other places as well. So one of the things we've been doing on top of doing the work of meeting with journalists and talking to journalists, both in Fort Collins and from across the state, is a series of webinars to talk about some of the key wicked problems that we are facing in the journalism world and how deliberative journalism can fit into some of the solutions around that. And so that's what we're doing here today. And it's good to just jump in, I think, then, and introduce our guest speaker today. And then once we've heard from Dominik, we'll turn it over to the panel. I'll introduce each panel member one at a time, and they'll respond to both what Dom had to share, as well as their own perspectives on this issue of misinformation. So Dominik Stekula is an assistant professor of political science at Colorado State University. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow in science and science of communication at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also held an appointment at Simon Fraser University in Canada. His research focuses on the changing media and both the supply and demand side of information influences, as well as citizens' beliefs and action, and how it influences citizens' beliefs and actions. So Dominik, I'll turn it over to you, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks, Mike. Let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen.
Hold on a second here.
All right. Yeah, go ahead, Martine.
Yeah, I have no idea what happened there. But I appreciate, it sounds like Mike just kind of jumped in and helped out there. We do have an interpreter now has come on. So before we kind of get into the content, we want her to kind of introduce how the interpretation works. We want to be able to have this recorded in Spanish available for that community. So I'll pass it over to Valentina.
That's right. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Valentina. I'm here on behalf of Community Language Co-op, here to provide and guarantee your commitment to language justice. Language justice is a type of simultaneous interpretation that seeks to create spaces in which no one language is dominant, spaces in which everyone can participate with the language of their heart. So to achieve this objective, we'll be using Zoom's interpretation feature. And what you will see in a couple of minutes is that a new button that looks like a globe will appear at the bottom bar of your screen, right where the other buttons are, the chat, video, and all of those other functions. When you see it, go ahead and click on it and select either English or Spanish as both the language that you will be listening and speaking into. If you have any questions or any trouble whatsoever with this technology, please let the whole group know by means of the Q&A function, I believe, because the chat is not currently working. And many thanks for having me here. I'll go ahead and share these instructions in Spanish, and then we'll be ready to start the interpretation. Hola a todos, a todas y a todos. Mi nombre es Valentina y estoy aquí por parte de Community Language Co-op para ofrecerles y garantizar su compromiso con la justicia del lenguaje, que es un tipo de interpretación simultánea que busca crear espacios en los que no domine ningún idioma, espacios en los que todas puedan participar con el idioma de su corazón. Para lograr este objetivo vamos a utilizar la función de interpretación de Zoom y lo que verán en un par de minutitos es que aparecerá un nuevo botón en la barra inferior de su pantalla que parece un globo terráqueo. Cuando vean este botón, selecciónenlo y elijan inglés o español como el idioma en el que desean escuchar y participar para esta sesión. Si tienen algún problema o alguna pregunta con esta tecnología, por favor comuníqueselo al grupo completo a través del chat. Perdón, a través de la función de Q y A, que están respuestas porque el chat ahorita no está activado. Muchas gracias y vamos a activar ahorita la interpretación.
So the interpretation button is now on there. So you can go on there and choose your selected language if you prefer. And then with that, I think we'll go ahead and I'll forego the rest of my introduction. I'm assuming Mike set y'all up pretty well. So we will go to Dominik.
All right, thanks, Martin. So let me just share my screen. I have a few slides just so that it's a bit easier to communicate. So do you guys see this? Okay. Okay, great. So I'm just gonna give a brief overview on some of the academic literature on this topic, especially some of the conceptual definitions and some of the best findings we have in terms of the actual prominence of misinformation, disinformation out in the information environment recently. So I think it wouldn't be surprising if I told you that, you know, the reason why we're talking about this is more or less because of what happened in 2016. Fake news became something that kind of raised to prominence during the election cycle, presidential election cycle. And it has since, as you can see, this is Google Trends searches for fake news. The kind of interest in that topic kind of peaked on the cusp of the election, and then more or less has been decreasing ever since. But we've still had this interest in these other residual terms. So even though fake news is going down, now we see interest in misinformation and disinformation going up in the meantime. So we have these terms that in the public sphere more or less operate interchangeably, but they're not the same. And there's this kind of conceptual mess out there. So I think that's the first thing I want to address. The other thing is that there's this, you know, underlying perception, i.e., you know, the fact that this panel exists, right? That disinformation and misinformation is something that is a really serious issue for us as a society, and especially for our democracy. Here's Barack Obama a few weeks ago saying that disinformation is a threat to our democracy and will continue to be unless we work together to address it. And we have had lots of big efforts aimed at addressing it, whether in the academic community, the kind of NGO community, scholarly community, you know, publishing various reports and studies. Also, the Department of Homeland Security recently was announced will host a disinformation governance board. So there's obviously lots of efforts to kind of address this issue. So I want to start with just trying to clarify some of the concepts here, because I don't think a lot of these concepts are particularly useful when they're just kind of used more or less interchangeably, and when essentially it frequently, as it operates in the public sphere, gets narrowed down to information that I don't agree with. So, you know, we have fake news. Fake news was something that kind of piqued our interest in the topic in 2016. We have misinformation, we have disinformation. But what do they mean exactly? And again, one thing that I do want to underlie is that fake news, I personally don't think is a particularly useful term. A lot of scholars really point to the fact that, you know, essentially since 2016, it has become more or less a partisan insult. It doesn't really have any analytical leverage anymore. It more or less boils down to just kind of further eroding trust in the news media per se. So I think there's other concepts out there that are particularly more useful. And one is information disorder. And when we talk about information disorder, it just captures a lot more of the things that we care about. So fake news, as they were kind of prominent in 2016, essentially referred to some of the stories that were fabricated, that were made to look like they were actual local news sources, but they were just fully made up stories. One very prominent one was about the Pope endorsing Donald Trump, which obviously did not happen. There was another one that was made to look like it was from an outlet called the Denver Guardian, which doesn't exist. It was just, you know, a made up website that essentially featured a made up story about how Hillary Clinton ordered a hit on some FBI agent, right? So fake news literally meant like made up content that looked like news. But this isn't the only thing that we care about, right? And even in 2016 and kind of how we think about what happened in that election, that doesn't encompass all of it, right? There were rumors, gossip, conspiracies, right? Various memes, etc., that don't really fall into the category of fake news. So I think it's really good to distinguish between these three features of information disorder. You have misinformation, which is essentially information that is false, but it is not necessarily shared with any intent to harm. So it's essentially, you know, somebody being misled into thinking that something is true, but they don't know themselves that it's not true. So they're spreading misinformation, but, you know, misinformation can just be being wrong, essentially, right? Disinformation is something that has that intent to harm. So it's made up stuff that is created and disseminated specifically for the purpose of reaching some sort of frequently political goal. And then there's also malinformation, which is more kind of in the realm of traditional kind of concepts like propaganda. And that's essentially truthful information that is distributed to kind of frame a particular debate in a specific way and achieve some sort of a harm. So for example, when Hillary Clinton's emails were hacked into, right, like that, the information that was then used from that hack was true, right? Like there was real emails, but the way it was packaged and the way that the whole thing came about kind of happened on the umbrella of, you know, achieving a specific political goal. So I think it's useful to kind of conceptualize the issue through that way. And just like two more points, you know, again, information does not have to be fake and made up to be misleading, and intent really matters here, right? So when we think about addressing information disorder, it's a different set of issues to address something that essentially means people who are kind of entrepreneurs and create fake things in order to make money or for political reasons, versus people who are essentially gullible and they're spreading things because they believe they're true, but they're not necessarily true, right? Those are different questions and they require maybe potentially different answers. Now, the second thing I wanted to highlight briefly is the fact that there's a lot of misinformation about misinformation out there, right? So we have, especially in the public sphere, this perception that misinformation is kind of super powerful, it's everywhere, and like people are super gullible and they're all falling for it and we're all worse off for that. And obviously there's some truth to that. Like, I wouldn't dedicate a lot of time studying these things if I didn't think they matter. But there's nuance there. And I think it's good to kind of understand some baselines here. So for example, in the 2016 cycle, the cycle that started it all, fake news was not particularly widespread. About a quarter of Americans were exposed, by the best estimates we have, to some of these fake news stories. And then due to all this outrage that happened as a result of what happened in 2016, and social media platforms really cracking down on some of these things, the amount and the reach of the misinformation by 2018 midterms has decreased by 75%. And another thing I wanted to highlight is that only 1% of Twitter users account for 80% of all fake news exposure, right? So there's a specific group of people who are really kind of in a little bubble of misinformation. But when we think about just society in general and just kind of like an average American, you know, these numbers are much smaller. So I think it's good to kind of understand that when we talk about fake news and misinformation, you know, when we mean it, when we say it means a specific thing, the exposure to that specific thing tends to be pretty low. Another thing I want to highlight, just like you know, misinformation and disinformation, just like any other information, obviously matters, and it can affect how we perceive things, how we, you know, and how it shapes our attitudes and beliefs. And ultimately, it might even shape our actions, right? Like, so, you know, misinformation about COVID and the safety of the vaccine, for example, might have influenced people to not take the vaccine, which is a very serious issue, obviously. But we have to remember that in general, these effects tend to be small in magnitude, right? So I think another thing that's pretty prominent out there in the kind of public debates is that people tend to have a view that just because some piece of misinformation or disinformation exists, we assume it's like particularly persuasive and just kind of changes minds. Where, you know, a single one-off exposure to any kind of content usually doesn't do it, right? So you usually need repeated exposure for anything to really sink in. And then lastly, we really need to understand that there's also, you know, in addition to the supply side, there is a demand side to these things, right? Some people are wired to kind of be more conspiratorial, be more populist, kind of seek out simple solutions, et cetera. All these like psychological and sometimes even partisan factors that really drive their kind of information seeking behavior. And, you know, I have a paper under review now where we looked at what happened to misinformation searches and traffic to specific websites when Facebook was down for about 8 hours in the fall. There was an unplanned outage of Facebook, right? And guess what? You know, the traffic to websites like InfoWars and Natural News, a lot of the kind of more conspiratorial, more kind of misinformation focused outlets skyrocketed, and search terms on Google for these things skyrocketed, right? So some people just have a need to seek out this information, and it's important to understand that that's part of the equation as well, right? So it's not just the supply and the kind of information environment, but it's also the demand part, right? And a lot of people are really driven to kind of seek out this kind of information. And then I'll finally say a few things about kind of solutions that are out there that scholars and others have been focusing on. There are a set of systemic things that have been obviously considered. One big thing is regulation. Obviously, regulation is tricky because these are very contentious issues, a very polarized country, and the moment a government will, you know, try to impose any kind of rules, you know, that will be a very contentious issue. And we can even look to Germany, which passed a law in 2017, kind of in the aftermath of what happened here in the United States. It was their fake news law that essentially was very well intentioned, and the goal was to make platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and other social media outlets essentially respond to government requests to take things down, content that was deemed, you know, fake and misleading and disinformation. But, you know, things like that also in Germany include, for example, kind of a libelous speech against politicians, which wouldn't really fly in this country, right? And really what has happened is that law has been criticized very heavily by human rights groups, by free speech groups. It, more or less, most experts agree it stifles free speech, and it has been used by authoritarian regimes in Russia and Philippines and other places to really justify their own laws that were kind of modeled after the German law. So government regulation is tricky. Platform design, you can get some stuff done that way. So if you're on Twitter, for example, and you want to share an article, Twitter might ping you and say, are you sure you want to share this without reading the article first? These interventions are based on research that shows that, when we kind of operate in kind of cruise control and we kind of lean into our partisan biases, we tend to spread a lot of this stuff. So slowing us down, having these kinds of pop-ups really works. So I think a lot of platforms, interjecting these kinds of interventions could work. Obviously, there's fact checking and news literacy, but these are also, there's some issues there. Fact checks tend to work, but people who seek out factcheck.org, for example, are not going to be the same people who are exposed to misinformation on something like the Joe Rogan podcast, for example, right? So the venue is different and you're not reaching the same audience. So I think that's a major issue with fact checking, right? How do we make sure that people actually, see that content that they produce? And then news literacy is great, but obviously an issue is that frequently there's this partisan underlying kind of arguments there about, this is just about indoctrination, etc. Right? So these are difficult issues to overcome. I'll conclude with a few points that my students and I were kind of working on last semester. We were working on a citizen's guide to navigating information disorder. And my students came up with, after a semester of research of a few points that, we as kind of consumers of information and participants in the information environment can take. And one thing that you can do is to make sure you have a somewhat healthy media diet, right? So don't just watch cable news or kind of engulf yourself in national culture wars on cable and in other types of outlets like that, but have a healthier media diet where you actually consume local news. Particularly, we're a community that's lucky in a sense that we do have fairly robust local media scene. Many places in this country lost their local outlets, and that has been a very detrimental effect to a lot of communities, right? They're more polarized, there's more political corruption, right? There's all kinds of downstream effects from that. Thinking twice before you share, right? They kind of don't feed the trolls and don't just kind of, there's a reason why this stuff tends to go viral, right? It feels good. It kind of allows you to engage in partisan cheerleading. It allows you to kind of signal to kind of your fellow, team Republican or team Democrat that you're a good team player. But these things, are ultimately not the best things to share, and don't kind of flood the information environment with that content. If something that you see seems crazy or implausible, it probably is, right? So double check things, right? If you're seeing something from like a Facebook meme or something, Google it, see if actual news are reporting on it. So double checking information can go a long way. And then there's already a lot of resources out there that are good. So for example, NewsGuard is a very cool browser plugin that's free to install based on research. And it it alerts you when you're on a website that has been shown to feature some content of questionable quality. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I'll just leave this here for a second. That's what my students came up with in December of last year. So they tried to summarize some of the things that I was just talking about briefly, and there's a lot more there. And I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dom. Appreciate that. So what I'm going to do is introduce the rest of our panel, and each time I do an introduction, that panelist will then respond to the talk or talk from their own personal experience in dealing with these issues. I decided to start with practitioners and then come back to the researchers. So I'm going to start with Rebecca Powell, who is the content strategist at the Coloradoan, and has been part of the team for 20 years. Part of her work is focused on creating a productive commenting forum bringing information from social media communities to the newsroom so questions can be answered, and understanding what the community wants and needs from their local news organization. She's part of the team that recently launched the Colorado in Conversations Opinion Forum in March. Rebecca, welcome, and let's hear your thoughts.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for hosting, and thanks for hosting the seminar, Martine. It's important for us to talk about this. I just kind of wanted to talk about the ways in which, the Coloradoan sort of sees and deals with misinformation. And one of those places is in our commenting forums, not super often. I mean, not, all the time, but, every now and then we'll have, especially during COVID times, facts pop in and something might seem kind of dubious. And so we'll go and check and see what we can learn about it. So that's a real balancing act, right? Because in the comments, we want people to be free to express their views, and we don't want to stifle any particular way of thinking or ideology or anything like that. But we do want people to be dealing with what we know to be true when they talk. So one thing that we know is that sometimes when things are stated as fact, what they're really stating are value judgments. And so then in that case, maybe it's not right to delete the comment, but, we're going to interpret that as, a value judgment. Instead, maybe we can engage them and talk a little bit more about, what is the underlying, value that they're trying to convey there. But sometimes what we'll do is just a real quick search of, a Google search, and we'll try to go directly to the source. We'll look at other media outlets across a wide spectrum and see what's been written about it. And if something is just so obviously and easily debunked, then we will sometimes message the person and let them know that we are removing their comment. If they want to post it later, if they want to post it again without including that information, then they can do that. So those are kind of the two different approaches that we take there. But then the other way that we deal with misinformation is by reporting it out. So a lot of times we'll, hear about a claim. And so then we try to just, go do our own reporting and write a story about it. So an example of that was last year with actually CSU and the vaccine mandate there. And there were some rumors circulating and even some national coverage about CSU supposedly arresting students or getting ready to arrest students who were not vaccinated and didn't have an exemption. And so, we obtained letters that were sent to students. We talked to CSU, and hopefully we were able to clear some of that up. So sometimes we'll do those fact check stories when we hear about claims. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Rebecca. Excellent. I am acting like the doctor who won't go to the doctor right now. And I keep forgetting to introduce myself. So I'm Mike Humphrey, and I'm an assistant professor in the Journalism and Media Communication Department. I spent about 20 years as a reporter, first for small town newspapers and eventually for metro and national publications. So, and next I want to introduce you to Sylvia Solis, who is the Community Engagement Director for the Colorado News Collaborative. She's worked as a journalist for the Longmont Leader, as a news reporter for Univision, and as a teacher for English learners in Mexico City and Spain. Sylvia has designed and led multiple communication strategies and community engagement projects at a local and state level here in Colorado, through which she has had the opportunity to engage in partnership and conversation with diverse communities. She received her MA in Media, Culture, and Communication from New York University. I also went to NYU, so go Violets, and BA in Communications and Marketing from Texas A&M International University. She currently serves on the board of directors for Intercambio, Uniting Communities in Boulder, participates as a fellow in the inaugural Trends Reporting Fellowship hosted by the Community Foundation in Boulder County and KGNU, and is part of Boulder County's Cultural Brokers Network. Sylvia, welcome, and let's hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for hosting us and having me here. So I'll start with giving a brief description of what the Colorado News Collaborative is, for those of you who are not familiar. So this is a startup nonprofit that has been around for about a couple of years, and it serves as a hub of ideas and resources for a large network of newsrooms across Colorado, which includes over 170 news outlets, and that includes radio, TV, newspapers, digital, all sorts of formats, as well as 270 journalists from these newsrooms, as well as freelancers. One of the pillars of the work that CoLab does is really revolves around doing work to create better news, right? So this whole aspect around collaboration really calls for an understanding that there are projects out there in terms of journalism that not one newsroom can do by itself. So if we are able to bring together newsrooms and journalists to work on really important investigative stories, and then put a project together that can really support the work of journalism across the state, then it's not just the newsrooms that benefit from this in terms of a thriving organizations, but also communities, right? And receiving that kind of quality work and product from news. This whole organization is really built around this idea that if you build it, they will come, right? If you have quality journalism for communities, then one can only assume that then communities will come to it and will really continue and increase their reliance on these organizations and these news outlets. But what we've come to realize or understand is that if there is no trust, or if there is no relationship or partnership between communities and newsrooms, then it's more complicated than just creating quality content, right? So a lot of the work that I do as a community engagement director for CoLab is working, designing, and leading projects that seek to increase that level of trust. And that starts with conversation, understanding, learning, engaging in partnership with community members to really learn from them and hear from them where are the shortcomings of local news media, to address some suggestions and recommendations coming from within communities that then newsrooms can really undertake. So part of one of the bigger initiatives that we're doing, it's called the Voices Initiative, has been to convene members of Black community in Colorado, Latinx community in Colorado, Asian, American, and Pacific Islander communities in Colorado. And this year, we're also focusing on Native and Indigenous community members in Colorado to listen to what they're saying, right? Like, what is that gap that exists in terms of trust that, and also access and representation that is not really promoting engagement with your local news media, with your local journalist. And the approach that we've taken is going beyond conversation and into action, right? So part of the work that we've done in partnership with the Colorado Media Project is looking at these recommendations that have emerged from conversations from these groups of these convenings with community members, to see how funding can be channeled into projects that either CoLab has led in partnership with other newsrooms, or people within community can lead to take actual action on some of these recommendations. So when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, I think there is really a very close connection with a lack of trust, and that is what the emphasis of my work is. So I'm happy to share any more that comes up in conversation around that.
Wonderful, thank you, Sylvia. Just a reminder to everyone that you are more than welcome to ask questions in the Q&A. We will get to a Q&A section of the discussion. But if you have one that's popping in your head right now, you're more than welcome to add it now in the Q&A button down at the bottom. Also, Martine is providing links to sources that our guests or our panelists are talking about. So if you look there, you'll see links to some of the topics that have come up already. And so we'll now turn to Anna Claire Crumpton, who is the Digital Communication Assistant for Poudre Libraries. In her daily work, she aims to properly inform patrons on library services and broader community issues through specialized content creation. As a library employee and an alumna of journalism and political science, she's passionate about the unique position of libraries as a trusted public institution to help their communities mitigate misinformation through education and programming. Anna Claire, welcome, and let's hear your perspective.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for having me today, and thanks for being here. When I think about misinformation, especially from a library perspective, it's our job as an institution and a trusted one to uphold democracy. And obviously, you know, information and news is a big cornerstone of what makes our democracy function on a day-to-day basis. The other side of that is that libraries and librarians are still trying to find a way to help their communities mitigate misinformation. And I think it's such a new concept that there are specializations like adult librarians that have news literacy and can teach patrons how to navigate the digital world. But at the same time, there's a lot of other things that the library does and specialized librarians that haven't dived into that yet. And so a lot of the academic journals surrounding libraries and misinformation have those viewpoints of we know we need to help and step in, but there's, you know, not a fully formed guide on how we do it. The other side of my job is that I do social media pretty much for Poudre River Public Library District. And so I think about misinformation on a daily basis. Obviously, we're not putting any misinformation out there, but from the comment section on certain posts or certain information we put out, you know, we have to do our best to make sure we're providing the most accurate information possible. So I'm excited to dig into the real issues that everyone brings up here. I know we have researchers and people like Rebecca and Sylvia that work on journalism every day. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Great, good to have you. So yeah, let's turn back to some of CSU's fine researchers. I will introduce you now to Katie Knobloch, who's the Associate Professor in the Department of Communication Studies and the Associate Director for the Center for Public Deliberation. Through her work, Katie helps communities create opportunities for deep and meaningful civic engagement. She regularly conducts facilitation training for students and community members that are designed to boost their ability to have productive conversations across difference. Katie, welcome. Thank you for being here, and let's hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this conversation. It's always nice to kind of learn and think through these big issues with other folks. So today we're talking a lot about how what media companies can do to counteract misinformation. But I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack because of my work. And the other way that we get information is through interpersonal conversations. And unfortunately, our interpersonal networks have actually seen a lot of the same polarization trends that our media outlets have. So as you likely know, our media consumption has gotten increasingly polarized. So we watch and pay attention to information that supports our pre-existing positions. And we also curate our social media feed so that it does the same, right? And that's kind of compounded by algorithms that give us the information we want to hear. Well, the same thing is basically happening in our personal lives, and I'll give you two examples of what that looks like in practice. First, we've lost a lot of the bridging organizations or institutions that used to connect us across difference. So these are things like PTA groups or churches or other community organizations where we just used to be able to kind of come together and get to know our neighbors as people first and as political actors second, right? And those were places that we got to meet people and interact with folks who were different from us. But it's not just that we've seen the decline in our local communities of those things, it's also that we have moved away from one another, right? So we are geographically segregated. So we're just not as likely to actually interact with folks who have different political ideologies than ourselves. And like with our media consumption, this has implications for what we know and understand about the world. So we often fall prey to the same issues of polarization. So we don't hear information that challenges our pre-existing positions. We start to perceive the world around us in polarized terms, and we start to become much more susceptible to misinformation because there's no one around who's going to challenge those beliefs or those factual inaccuracies. And that's exactly where the CPD comes in. We are explicitly designed to encourage conversations across difference. And as part of that work, we host community meetings that bring together diverse members of our community. And we train our graduate and undergraduate students to facilitate those conversations with the goal of ensuring that everyone in that small group discussion has a chance to share their perspective. So during those conversations, our participants act as experts in their own communities. They tell us what it means to live in these communities, and they also respond to information provided by experts. So as part of our training for our facilitators, we have to train them how to handle those moments when people bring up information that we either know to be false or that we think might be false. And there are a few things that we like to tell our facilitators to keep in mind. And these are strategies you can use both interpersonally and also on social media. The first is simply to try to avoid winning. So once you focus on winning the conversation, you are already hindering your chances of having the person that you are speaking to reflect, right? So in short, if you are not willing to challenge your own beliefs and perspectives, you shouldn't expect your conversation partner to do that either, right? So we kind of have to come with an open mind and be willing to challenge our own beliefs. Moreover, the focus on winning is actually counterproductive. So we often think that if we just correct the misinformation, or if we help them understand some key point, we can convince them that they are wrong. But that's not really how persuasion works. And it's particularly not how it works on these big issues that, you know, are part of our deeply held beliefs, and in many cases are part of our identities. And we know that when we have those kinds of big issues, the things that are actually persuasive are when we ask folks questions and when we share our stories. So we try to move our conversations towards that angle rather than kind of, you know, getting into the weeds about this one piece of misinformation. So there are a few kind of practical things that we do. The first is simply to bracket it. We can set aside that misinformation. And as many of our panelists talked about tonight already, we can really focus on the values, right? Just what Rebecca was talking about. Why do you care about this issue? What does it mean to you? So we can set it aside and talk about the values. Another thing, and we'll probably talk more about this, is to simply like ask about source credibility. So where did that information come from? What makes you trust that information, right? You can also just say, it's so hard to know what to believe. I have those same problems, right? So kind of, you know, putting yourself in that other person's position, understanding that, like Dr. Stekula said, they're not necessarily operating from a place of bad intent and disinformation. They probably just genuinely believe these things to be true, even though they are not, right? So just asking them about where that information came from can help kind of nudge them in the direction of thinking, well, wait a second, is that true, right? And then finally, you can offer counter evidence, but really kind of speaking from your own experience, right? So what's the information that led you to believe the thing that you believe rather than challenging the information that they believe, right? So these are things that you can do both interpersonally and online. Again, thinking a little bit more about that interpersonal context, but a lot of these big ideas kind of come to fruition in the same ways in our interpersonal conversations.
Excellent. Thank you, Katie. That's really interesting. And so I will conclude by introducing one of my colleagues, David Wolfgang, who teaches communication law and media in society. His research focuses on public discourse and media sociology. In particular, he studies the relationship between journalists and online commenters. Wolfgang is also interested in journalism, role conceptions, representations of minority groups in media, political communication, and new media. He uses textual analysis, ethnography, interviews, and survey methods for his research. And it's appeared in publications such as Journalism, Journalism Studies, Journalism Practice, Digital Journalism, and the Journal of Public Deliberation. David, thanks for being here, and take it away.
Thanks, Mike. That's a lot of journals in the journalism context. Yeah,
your credibility is high.
Thank you to Mike, and thanks a lot to Dominik. I appreciated getting to hear his perspective and get to hear a little bit more about his work and some of the things related to it. And I can't agree more with a lot of the points that have been made already. I'm just glad, first of all, that we're talking about this in the context of local journalism, because I think it's so critical that we have these conversations in the spaces where, you know, trust in media can be the most critical, rebuilding or kind of trying to protect what's left of the understanding of that relationship between audiences and trust in their media organizations, which still to many in America is still most kind of resilient at the local media level. So the fact that we're starting at that point and staying in that conversation around local media is really critical to how we think about this. We often talk about journalists in like this kind of normative context as being or having this obligation to the truth and to reporting the truth and protecting it. And we don't often talk about that in the context of the obligation of the audience member as well, to think about that kind of context of what's their relationship to truth and how they can play a part in helping to maintain that kind of that integrity. And the more we become a more interactive internet kind of media context, that becomes more and more critical. So I think that this reciprocity of understanding of truth and trust and the relationship between both agencies, both the institution and the different agents online, can be really critical to how we think about the problem. But going beyond journalism's like traditional understanding of its obligation to truth, we also have to think about like this obligation to engage the audience in this kind of conversation, not just the audience, but all the different stakeholders in a community in this conversation about, you know, what are our expectations of discourse and deliberation and conversation. And, you know, I mean, the very difficult conversations we have to have with our community about, for instance, you know, how to open the minds of intransigent people who are unwilling to see beyond certain perspectives. It's not the idea that we have to like beat people over the head with persuasion. It's the idea that we have to engage them where they are. And when you're constantly running into people who can become quite entrenched and intransigent, how do you find ways to continue that conversation? Because like the minute we give into this idea that we can give up on certain parts of society or certain people because they are no longer able to have their minds changed, it's as if we have to give up on the idea that we want to protect certain democratic norms. And I really don't think that that's the direction we want to take journalism in. I also want to, I guess I don't have to go down the road of talking about kind of filter bubbles and the kinds of ideas of people being trapped in their own worlds of ideological perspectives, because I think we've talked about it quite a bit today, but I'll add my voice again to the idea that a lot of this can happen within the space of people who are living within a space where they are consistently being told the same things, and it's not difficult for them to buy into the same views and to double down with them because it's all they ever hear. And the way in which they process information seems to suggest that they can more easily store that away as a given fact because it hasn't been challenged or pushed against that much for them. What I do want to add a little bit about real quickly here, because I know we can turn it over to questions that would be probably more productive, is just the idea that we've got to find a way in our relationships between individuals and institutions like journalism and democratic institutions to find better conversations. Because, you know, as we've seen over the last few weeks in the discussion about, for instance, Elon Musk and Twitter, social media platforms are not going to save us from ourselves, and institutions like our legal system is not going to save us from this problem. Misinformation and disinformation is essentially treated as traditional forms of free speech. This is really going to come down to this understanding that we have a responsibility to protect the integrity of quality discourse and discussion in society, and it exists between the independent actors, not the government and not corporate actors, so journalists, citizens, to take that obligation upon themselves and not rely on other institutions to protect it for them.
That's excellent. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of really good ground just in the introductions, and I appreciate that. One of the things that Martine asked of people who signed up for this webinar today was to ask questions. What questions do you have coming into the discussion? And I think we did a nice job of looking at the variety of the ways we can answer one of the big questions that a lot of people had, and that is what can be done, and that especially when we think about it in terms of the DOMS concept of information disorder. There's so many different ways to think about what can be done, from these sort of big scale media level all the way to the point Katie was making about that interpersonal level. And I just wonder if we could dig in a little deeper here. And so, Dom, I'm going to start with the question for you, and then I really want to open it up to anybody who thinks, who really wants to talk about this. You mentioned that there has been some research that shows some of these tactics that social media platforms have used to sort of mitigate misinformation have worked and are working, either in experimental conditions or perhaps in real-time work. Can you talk a little bit more about that, a little more about what you think does work on those platforms, and then also what the role a local media might have in working both on those platforms and on their own platforms? Thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. So yeah, I was mentioning, like, to understand the interventions, I guess we have to understand the reasons behind the motivations that certain news consumers have. So a lot of these things have already been mentioned, right? Like, we increasingly are more polarized. Partisanship is an important part of our identities, and especially the most engaged people, the kind of people who would comment and really participate on social media. Those are the people who are the most likely to engage in kind of partisan motivated reasoning and really kind of have their kind of partisan blindfolds on when they process this information. So that's one reason why people engage with this stuff. And there's really, there's not that much that can be done about these things, because, it's not that social media necessarily makes our, social media, misinformation, disinformation, it's not that stuff makes our politics toxic, right? Our politics got toxic before social media existed, right? And these trends and growing distrust in and polarization have been going on well before social media kind of achieved prominence. So I think a lot of the information disorder stuff is more of a symptom of our toxic politics versus a result of it. So on that front, not much that we can do, but other research shows that there are other factors that drive people to kind of engage with this kind of content. One is kind of cognitive reflection, and essentially some people are more likely to just process that information that they engage with on kind of autopilot. And some people are more kind of, they reason more thoroughly about things. And when you're operating in an autopilot situation, the most effective way in which we can counteract these forces is to slow people down. So a lot of the research, the stuff that I mentioned earlier, like the pop-ups about, are you sure you want to share this without reading it first? These are the things that relate to the cognitive reflection part, right? These kinds of interventions in terms of kind of how you design Facebook or Twitter or whatever will be the next big platform. They're not going to be able to solve polarization for us necessarily, but on some of these other things, right? Like, we can make some inroads. So I think that's like a good distinction to keep, and that's kind of where the work and the academic work and what the platforms have been doing has been lining up, right? So they have been doing things on that front. Another one is linking to fact checks and providing labels. That stuff tends to go a long way, but again, it's not gonna necessarily undo the distrust some people have for the elites, for example, right? Like, source credibility is useful heuristic for some people, but some people kind of thrive in they rejoice in the fact that something that they're sharing is not like a legitimate media outlet, because those are the elites, and elites are bad, right? They're kind of more kind of populist tinge stuff. So, so it's good to kind of keep that in mind as well, right? That like not every intervention is going to fix everything for everybody, right? People bring in a lot to the table when we think through these things. And there's, on the demand side, there I think is a lot to be done in terms of really understanding what really does it for different kinds of people, right? And when you think of Twitter playing around with like a certain label or something and testing it on millions and millions of users, right? It's going to work for some users, but it's not going to work for others. And for yet another group, it might totally backfire, right? And it might kind of trigger even more response in a kind of wrong direction among them.
Very good, thank you. And we do have a question in the Q&A. I'll bring that up in a moment, but it to some degree, it's at least has an element of trust to it. And you mentioned that just a moment ago, Dom, and I'm wondering, Sylvia and Rebecca, in terms of trying to develop trust, especially with communities who have been harmed potentially by mass media in the past, either misrepresented or forgotten, erased, things like that, or people who don't feel like they see their perspective in the media. What are some ideas that you have that can help with that level of trust that can get us back to talking about facts in shared ways? Not an easy question, Sylvia. Thank you for.
Yeah, certainly. I think I will start by saying that one thing to consider when you're looking at the different contributing factors that may be exacerbating issues around misinformation and trust is, cultural and historical factors, right? So for a lot of the work that we do working with communities of color, we are really thinking about how culture and history might be impacting perceptions, right? And relationships. As you all said, there might be some harm that has been made, and has impacted negatively communities and community members. One of the working groups that we did with Black Coloradans, their top recommendation, or the top recommendation that came out of that process, was to name and acknowledge how local news coverage and media institutions have negatively impacted Black Colorado communities, right? So I think there is a lot to be said about how individual newsrooms, or the entire news media ecosystem can take some action around naming and acknowledging some of the harm that has happened against communities to try and repair some of that, broken trust. And I think that could, potentially have some positive implications in terms of how local media is perceived, right? Because I think many times when there is no trust, then individuals and communities start relying on more informal sources of information that could be more misleading, right? That could contain more of that misinformation, and could potentially, exacerbate the harm and the impact in that way. I think, part of what we also heard from community members in both the Black and the Latinx is this idea of keeping news media accountable, right? So looking at diversity, what are some of the actual numbers in the newsroom, right? Like, what is the actual representation that exists within any given newsroom and the entire industry? Because I think there is something to be said about, when you see yourself reflected, right? Or members of communities of color see themselves reflected in the news media, then that can also achieve, an increasing level of trust, and not just in terms of the staff within news outlets, but also the sources, who are journalists speaking to, what are the sources and the experts and the individuals that are part of the stories, what is the content comprised of, and looking at all these different aspects, I think can really help to begin to address some of the concerns that community members might have towards news media, and thus, continue to build a relationship that can yield, more trust.
Very good. Rebecca.
Yeah, Mike, I would totally echo all of that and just say that it's all about the relationship, all of that starts with relationship building. And so part of that, acknowledging the mistakes that, we have made in the past and the way that we've harmed communities, part of that is then, building a relationship with them now and going to where they are and, understanding what's important to them and not asking things of them, but asking how we can reflect their community. So those are some things that we're working on at the Colorado. We know we have a lot of work to do, and we're starting to do the hard work of that.
Excellent. I just want to open this up in this topic to anybody else. Anybody else have thoughts on this? Reestablishing trust? And while you're thinking about that, I'll just mention to a few people who've put comments in the Q&A. The question that's coming up is about that, but also like how we define misinformation, how we fact check and things like that. So I'll bring that up. And just so you know, those of you in the audience, I'm seeing that, and that's the next thing we're going to talk about. But anybody else want to talk about this question of trust? I'll take that as a no. So there's several questions here, and they sort of align with themselves pretty nicely. So it starts with, how do you choose what you claim is misinformation? I'm really glad this question's coming up because it's one of the things that was on my mind as well coming into this discussion. And one of the examples Chris is making in the Q&A is some of the information that about COVID that was, resisted early on by certain members of, on social media platforms, for instance, who were then banned for saying this is not wrong because it was coming from something like the CDC. And it's, I think we're all learning that all this information is very complicated in a brand new situation with a virus that we've never seen before. Some of the things that were claimed to be the truth by the CDC early have been redacted and or corrected since then. Chris also asks, you talk about fact checks, but who checks the fact checker is another good question. And then Deanna adds, how do journalists as a profession hold each other accountable for providing truthful information? I really, and I'll just add one more, how do we as citizens hold them there and ourselves accountable, which is a nice way to think about the balance of that. I think everybody on the panel has insights about this question about, how do we define what this means? And I know, Dom, you mentioned this in your talk a little bit, but I think this also applies, Katie, to these interpersonal conversations. How do you get to the place in interpersonal conversation, for instance, where you can say, okay, now we're resting on what we can agree are facts here. Now let's talk about something. Do you have thoughts about that? And then maybe we'll work our way back up to media again.
Sure. How do we define misinformation? I think it's like pretty unhelpful almost always in an interpersonal conversation to get into a back and forth about like a fact, right? Sometimes what's happening is actually you're just bringing in two different pieces of information and you compare them to one another, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that one is true and the other is not true, right? They're just supporting different parts of the argument. So again, I think kind of like drawing on our own personal experiences and being clear about where we're getting information from and why we trust it is one way to handle that conversation. Sorry, would you mind repeating the other part of that question, Mike?
Well, the other part about it is holding these people accountable, holding journalists accountable, holding the people who are defining what is dismiss or malinformation, the people who are saying this is fitting in a certain bucket. Where's the accountability for that bucket placing, I guess?
Sure. Yeah. And I think part of it is like first holding ourselves accountable, right? Like, so part of it is just, I think, like, be honest with yourself about your own media consumption habits and kind of break out of those things. But I think that there's kind of a larger problem in our systems of folks getting like disconnected from political decision makers, right? So whether that's journalists or politicians or folks running like advocacy campaigns or whomever it might be, I think one of the things that we actually need to do is like rebuild our linking institutions that give us opportunities to interact with one another. Because I think we talk about like our own media bubbles, but it's also easy like to get into our professional bubbles, I think, and in our kind of, I think that it's really true of those of us who kind of work in the political space, that like we have an obligation to continuously make sure that we are returning to and having conversations with communities. Otherwise, it's really difficult to even understand like what we should be talking about and what people care about. So I think part of it is just creating those connections with one another.
Very good. Thank you. And David, I know that that when you look at news comments and news sections, you run into this question a lot, that the distrust, the mistrust, the accountability questions. Do you have thoughts on this in terms of ways to sort of create accountability around the way we define misinformation, disinformation, and so forth?
Well, I think a lot of this comes down to issues of transparency. Institutions, large institutions like journalism haven't always been, and social media, I should say as well, haven't always been that great about always being transparent about these practices. I think journalists are better about fact checking and transparency. They usually, especially in an institutional manner, not publish something that goes along with why they made the determination that something was or was not checked as fact or false. Whereas social media has gotten really kind of a hard, gotten into the kind of practice of just deeming something as misinformation or disinformation, and then just kind of like playing whack-a-mole and removing it from their site without any transparency. But it does kind of bring up the secondary question of, if you have legitimate reasons, supposedly, for removing something from discourse, and then you then explain the reasons for why it must be removed from discourse, have you just therefore then helped to give oxygen to ideas that you were purposefully trying to remove from discourse? So it becomes kind of a slight catch-22 problem, but I really do think there are ways to have conversations about transparency, about decisions, about what should potentially be kind of excoriated or removed in a sense, without doing it in a really kind of black box, hidden manner. And that could be really helpful for trying to encourage more transparency from others in this space.
Makes a lot of sense. And Anna Claire, you have this interesting position because you belong to an institution. Sometimes Martine talks about the concept of honest brokers, people that can kind of hold us together, those bridging elements and I think a lot of people see libraries that way. We posted the Library Bill of Rights Amendment number 2 in our conversation beforehand. It says libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues. Materials should be not prescribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. And I'm just wondering, from a library perspective, with a journalism and political science background, where do you think libraries fit in this discussion of both the question of information disorder, but also the question of trust?
Yeah, Mike, great question. And I had pulled that from the Library Bill of Rights kind of in response to a question about libraries being neutral. And one of the great things about libraries is that we are absolutely committed and responsible to everybody in the community. So free and equal access for all. And that makes us have a really interesting perspective on this issue, because obviously we're going to provide all kinds of viewpoints and opinions and expressions in our collection. But when it comes to the facts, it can't necessarily be neutral about the facts. And we also feel that simultaneous responsibility to informing our community with the correct information. And so we very much so feel accountable to mitigate misinformation, while also providing a broad collection and diverse number of voices, and also understand that viewpoints and those interpersonal conversations are where a lot of these issues around misinformation take off, and not everyone is going to take the initiative to walk into a library and pick up 3 different books from people with opposing viewpoints. I mean, I don't think everyone does that on a daily basis. So it comes back to confirmation bias in a way as well, that we seek out the information that we already know and trust and feel partisan from a partisan perspective. So we are uniquely positioned as an institution for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And just to kind of wrap this up, and then one other element of this question showed up that I can actually talk about a little bit as a former journalist, but back to Dom for one moment. I know in your book, you talk about the issue of being able to talk across these ideological divisions or party divisions. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, and what role does that play in healing some of this disorder that people start talking across their belief systems again? How important is that?
Sure. Thanks for reading the book, Mike. Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because when you look through, and it's not something that's just prominent on social media, but you know, the loudest people, right, from both parties are the most extreme people from both parties, right? Like when you look at Twitter, right, it's not really like the people closer to the center that get the most attention, right? Like Mitt Romney and like Susan Collins aren't really being talked about all that much, right? It's Ted Cruz, it's Madison Cawthorn, it's Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's these kinds of people. And research shows that like media, like mainstream media in this country have increasingly given megaphone to these voices, right? So what used to be the case that, you know, Senator John McCain used to dominate as the person who was kind of cited the most by all kinds of media outlets for like decades, essentially. You know, starting in around 2010 or so, these patterns have changed, and it's at first been people like Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, and obviously Donald Trump, but you know, it's not just limited to the Republican Party, right? On the left as well, like people don't really talk about like some of the more kind of centrist, boring Democrats. They talk about AOC and the Squad, etc., right? So the reason I'm mentioning this is because essentially, when people kind of engage with the information in their media ecosystem, whether it's the social media stuff or just reading the news, this is essentially their perception of the other side, right? Their perception of the other side is driven by the most extreme elements of that side. So that essentially leads to a lot of partisan stereotypes. So we have a lot of public opinion data showing that people essentially view the other side as this kind of crazy caricature, right? You think Republican. If you're somebody on the left, you think of Republican, you think somebody who like stormed the Capitol on January 6th, right? When you're a Republican and you think of a Democrat, you think of, you know, some like Jacobin magazine reading socialist living in like a commune in New York or something, right? But like that's vastly inaccurate, right? Most people are not like the most extreme versions of both parties. So the kind of what we did for the book is we brought people together to actually it happened in the libraries around Philly. And I think that's like a really good space for that kind of work to happen, because those places are community hubs. So we essentially brought people in for a short kind of discussion about politics, and we created groups of kind of cross partisans, right? And what happens in real life, that like the meaningfulness of an in-person interaction is precisely because it doesn't allow you to default to this narrative that you might have built up in your head about that other person being like a crazy lefty or a crazy right-winger. Because when you're sitting in a room with them together and you notice, oh, like this guy's also wearing like a Sixers jersey, and I like the Sixers, so this person cannot be that bad, right? Like you develop shared bonds. You realize that, oh, this person like lives in my neighborhood too. So like it's easier to just develop these deeper connections, have a meaningful conversation, and to default to these partisan caricatures that we kind of build in our heads that are kind of constructed with the help of the media and the social media. So I think that's a really important part. And going back to what Katie was talking about earlier, when even our communities are becoming little echo chambers, right? And I popped in a little link to a paper by the New York Times that actually uses the data from a paper that was published in the journal Science like 2 years ago. And you can put in your address and see how many of your neighbors are of, you know, Republicans versus Democrats, right? So the reason why I'm mentioning that is like, you know, if we actually live in our bubble, these meaningful conversations with people from the other side are becoming more rare as well, right? And we don't have as many opportunities to then develop these bonds and kind of crush some of these stereotypes that we have and be like, well, maybe, yeah, sure, there's some crazy people on the other side, but these guys are nice. And like, I can have like a thoughtful conversation with them and maybe not agree on everything, but I know they're not crazy, right? And I think that's like a first step in really trying to lower the temperature on the partisan discourse and really kind of taking a step back and engaging in some of these more meaningful interactions, right? Because that's when you actually can do things and form a consensus and realize that, you know, it's not about critical race theory, it's about building a bridge over I-25 or something, right? Like we can do something meaningful in our community without engaging in some national culture war stuff.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that because we were really hoping to focus on that local element. Sylvia, I see your mute is off, so I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to this question around accountability, right? How journalists as a profession can hold each other accountable. And I like what David said around transparency. I think at the organizational level, one thing that we're working on right now is we partner with a news leader association, Collab did, to conduct a survey in Colorado to get a baseline measurement of diversity in the state's newsroom, right? So that is a project that is underway, right? It just really to understand and know and have that, you know, data available for others to know what diversity actually exists within newsrooms right now. At the individual level, there is this shift in the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, in journalism, that's moving away from this narrative around objectivity, right? I think there's more and more a recognition that, you know, journalists can and should strive to be fair, but that they cannot really be objective, right? Like identity, experience, background informs reporting. So, you know, this is why, you know, it just brings me back to an earlier point around having diversity within newsrooms, right? So that there is more representation across diversities and intersections of diversity, of identity, I'm sorry. And that the more and more perspectives can be represented, right? So that there is no reliance on any one kind of perspective, you know, thinking about this bubble, but that the consumers of news can, you know, really see that there is more and more of a diverse take on what is reported and how it is reported.
That is great. And just one other wrinkle that Chris brings in is this question of the wall between advertising and editorial, which those of us who've done journalism for a while know that's become really complicated. And so, you know, that brings us back to, in this more complicated media world, how accountability plays into this, and what are strategies for accountability that represent what you were just talking about, Sylvia, that the newsroom looks like the community, you know, and then also that we have the kind of transparency that David was talking about that leads to at least understanding the process of how we get to from our work to a product that we put out into the world. Dom, I know you have thoughts about this as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that accountability question from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, because like what Sylvia said is exactly it. And we see in a lot of studies with, like, why is trust in journalism, especially at the national level, right? It's higher in the local news, considerably higher. But why is it so low? And I think the issue is exactly that, right? Like, I think Pew Research Center had a study a few years ago that showed that something like 80% of journalists in kind of national media outlets live in 3 metro areas: New York, DC, and LA, right? So it's bi-coastal elites. It's people increasingly coming from a very specific set of background, right? Like usually very elite schools, usually from like fairly wealthy background, because those are the people who can afford to go to very, very wealthy, prestigious schools. And that really plays a role in that trust, right? Like it's, we have a huge, I think, underrepresentation of people coming from like kind of lower socioeconomic status in journalism at the national level, in addition to all the other, racial, ethnic, gender, etc. dynamics. But I think that plays a role. And, when people who are more predisposed to distrust the news, and that tends to be in this country people on the political right, see kind of who works in the news rooms of these national outlets, they do see quote unquote bi-coastal elites, right? And they're not wrong. They literally are bi-coastal elites. They mostly live on the major cities on the 2 coasts, and they're mostly elites because they come from privileged backgrounds. And I think because of that, they view them essentially as the kind of people who are, they're just the other side, right? They're the Democrats. They're like the same as the constituency of the Democratic Party. So they just don't view them as kind of fair arbiters of truth. And I think that is an issue, right? Like, because of these backgrounds and because of these things, like that's, I think, ultimately at the heart of these trust issues. And I think that's when local journalism can really thrive, because like if local outlets look like their communities, this issue doesn't exist, right? Like it's easier to break through. So
David, I feel something coming up in you. Am I wrong?
I mean, I think they've covered it quite well. I mean, specifically trying to replicate the kind of diversity and representation that we need in our communities through our media, and try to have that reflected as a critical part of trying to get there. And having a reciprocal level of trust, but also respect between media and between audiences, I think can also be a really helpful kind of context, because we often see that audiences feel as if they're not a valued part of the production process or the process of making decisions, or how content is kind of promoted or distributed, and that there can be a better relationship or reciprocity there, I think is really critical.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just put a fine point on this. There was a dust up in the journalism world a couple of weeks ago. There's a researcher who tries to look at the question of diversity in newsrooms and surveys newsrooms around the country. And that researcher was hoping for a large representation of newsrooms across the country to self-report the diversity in the room. And it turned out that it was a very, very small, paltry number of newsrooms who were willing to be transparent about that. And I think that's the kind of thing that Chris is asking about, that David has addressed, that Dom is addressing. Not only are we underrepresented in terms of demographics of any one community, it can be really hard for a newsroom to begin the practice of being more transparent. Rebecca, I know you all at the Coloradoan have tried this. You've talked about diversity in your newsroom, in the paper. Can you talk a little bit about the struggle of that switch from, what happened in the newsroom tended to stay in the newsroom at one point in our history, and how does transparency, how does that become a practice in the profession, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a real trend right now in, a good trend in news right now to be transparent about your processes. And that those are some things that we've tried to do. And that's, taking people through, why we chose to write a story. Sometimes it's a column written by our editor that will, or even sometimes our reporters we actually have a newsletter that comes out weekly, and it's headed by a reporter who will write, who will explain the story that they wrote that week and why they chose to write it, kind of trying to get behind the scenes. You'll notice that like the Colorado Sun has some really good features on their website where at the top of each story, it'll have credibility factors. Like this has got, a couple of different, this is original reporting. I think there are things you can do like that to, to explain where your reporting comes from. But yeah, I know at the Colorado, we've just tried to do a few different things. We have a trusting news landing page there where we have everything that we've ever written about our processes or why we do things are housed there. And we have an article on how we report on crime. And we've recently changed some of our policies and procedures on crime reporting. And so we'll be updating that, and that'll be there. A lot of times people will say, well, why don't you report on, something happened over here and, it turned out to be, a suicide. And we don't usually write about suicides. We have a whole article explaining how we report on suicide and when we do and when we don't. So I think too, like, just thinking about the comments and a place that I live in the comments, we do try to be more transparent and answer people's questions there. And as I said earlier, if we do feel like we need to remove a comment, we will respond to the person and let them know that we're doing it rather than just removing it. Or we will respond to the comment and not remove the comment and explain, that there's some unfactual information in there.
Yeah, I've witnessed that, and it does seem effective. Anna Claire, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm gonna backtrack a little bit, but it's in the same vein of this. We were talking about the community conversations, or like Dominik, you were talking about how, when you put different partisans at the same table and they have a conversation, it actually ends up being a pretty effective conversation. Was that like in reference specifically to misinformation? Because I know that's a lot of what the CPD does on a daily basis. I mean, I know that they just did one with the Diversity and Equity Office for the city of Fort Collins, and it would be an interesting way if that could be channeled into back to the question of how do local communities and newsrooms tackle misinformation. Like, would that be a new category in the solutions that you presented in the slides?
That's an open question. Actually, it's a great question. Our study was just, bringing people for partisan conversations, right? So it wasn't in the context of misinformation. It was not in the context of kind of correcting anything. But I think that's a useful next step potentially, right?
Thanks for answering my question.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. There are kind of two ways to think about this. One is that there are some deliberative forums that are explicitly designed to have participants grapple with competing information. So one of the things that they do is they just put up lists of of claims, and they say which of these feels reliable and why, and which of them contradict one another. And then they take those contradictory claims and they start to really work through and understand where that information came from, what its context was. And that's a space where you might find out maybe one is right and the other is wrong, but most often it's kind of, they're just talking about something in a different context or a different angle. And the other thing, I mean, all of you have been talking a lot about diversity in the newsroom and being reflective of wider communities. And there is some momentum towards, I mean, and this is a great example of it, right? Like this whole program is an example of it, of community-led journalism where, journalists will follow, either kind of host their own forums or they will follow an existent forum, and they use the forum as a source of information. So they're reporting on the things that get shared during the forum, and then that gets the community voices broadcast to the wider community rather than just kind of staying in that conversation.
I'd like to share, an example of this. We actually have partnered with the CPD and the Institute for Science and Policy that is housed in the Denver Museum for Nature and Science to actually host an in-person event, a two-part series event with community members, during which we're actually going to be talking about mis and disinformation within the context of the news media. So really this event will help us discuss, as a group, the effect of disinformation on local communities, journalism, scientific information, trust, and our democracy. And the goal is for, members of the community who are joining this particular event, as well as journalists who will be joining this event, to come up with a set of, community-driven recommendations around how to address, how the media and community members can confront misinformation and disinformation within Colorado, right? So I think, and this is part of, the work that we're doing with CPD, and it will entail some facilitation training for journalists to really take part of this conversation. And it's going to be, I think, very interesting to see what comes out of that. But I would say that that would be a really good example of how we can come together, institutionally with community members within the context of the news media and have, dialogue and deliberation around this particular topic.
Yeah, that is really exciting. And it's a good segue into how I'd like to spend the last part of our discussion, which is talking about solutions in terms of different members of the community. So like community working together to create solutions around not just the information problem itself, but all of the components around that, the other issues that we've been talking about, either misunderstandings about the way media works, whether it's social media or mass media, how to deal with misinformation in the first place when you feel like you are being confronted with it, and so I would just want to think about it from many different levels, including individuals. So let's start there. I know, Katie, that you train students to work on misinformation. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you think the individual responsibility is in all of this?
Sure. I think the first piece of responsibility, which I had touched on earlier, is kind of holding ourselves accountable. It's a lot easier than we think to spread misinformation. And I think that we kind of just need to be willing to hold ourselves accountable. And I think another thing interpersonally is just being open to learning. And by being open to learning ourselves, we make it easier for the person that we're having a conversation with to be open to learning. So like I said, either bracketing that information and saying, like, whether or not this is true, why do you think that why is this issue important to you? Or, one of the things that we always talk about is teaching folks to identify values and then to have the conversation about values, right? Because what's actually often happening is we're using that information not to form an opinion, but to back up our already formed opinion, right? So we're not actually arguing about the piece of information, we're arguing about our underlying positionality. So I think it's often important just like, let's set this aside for a moment and let's talk about what we really came here to talk about or what we really care about. And then, this actually comes a lot from the social media space about questioning source credibility, just kind of talking about who your sources are and being clear about that, being comfortable asking people why they feel a certain way, why they got to where they are. So I think just kind of being clear, open, and transparent about where you're getting information from and why you hold a position, rather than getting into that like I'm going to tell you why you're wrong, right? The minute you start trying to say, I'm going to tell you why you're wrong, you've basically already lost the conversation, right? People aren't coming to a conversation for debate. Hopefully they're coming so that we can learn from one another, and resetting that conversation starts with us taking that perspective.
Do you think there's a reflex to answer to have an answer instead of moving into, and so do you have some mental tricks for how you stop yourself and do the slowing down Dom was talking about earlier?
Sure. My students have actually been like really interested in this concept lately. So they've been doing a lot of work around mindfulness. There's other facilitators who talk about just like standing in the fire. Part of it's just like being reflective and realizing it's not about you. I think often when we're getting into arguments, we start kind of like, like Dr. Stekula was talking about, we start kind of drawing on the most extreme versions. And we often start talking about these politicians who have so little to do with our actual lives, right? So returning it back to, what does this look like for you and your community? And why do you think that this is a big deal? Actually allows you to have a much more concrete conversation than arguing about these facts or these positions from these folks who you might never interact with and might not ever actually influence your daily life.
And one other question about the individual, and Dom, you touched on this. I don't know if you have a thought on this, anybody, is the question of intent. Because, when we talk about, and Katie, you may have thoughts on this too, but when we talk about wanting to have a conversation that's generative, that's helpful, that makes you walk away and feel like you learned something about somebody, is an intention. And of course, there are other intentions floating around this information ecosystem all the time. Any thoughts on one, how we get a sense of what intention is there? Do we need to know that? Or and where does intention play in all of this? Because it seemed like an important part of your definition early on, Dom.
Yeah, I think the really crucial thing is that social media especially are not built for these kinds of interactions, right? It like when I was talking about the book, right? Like the hard part about the book was bringing people together, right? And like actually ensuring they're in the same room at the same time and talking about the thing we want them to talk about. Social media is built for exactly the opposite, right? Like, if you post something thoughtful on Twitter, like, sit, nobody cares, right? But like, pour some gasoline on a fire, right? Like do something dumb, like maybe dunk on Madison Cawthorn or AOC or whatever you choose, right? That's going to take off like wildfire. And I think, that's the issue here, is that, these platforms are not built for the things that we need them to be built for, right? They're built for, they incentivize the worst behavior, right? They kind of play into the worst instincts that we have as kind of partisans and motivated reasoners, etc. Right? They kind of are built for engagement. They're built to ensure that they have your attention for the longest time possible, because ultimately, like they're not public squares. They're essentially a marketing firm, right? Like Facebook and Twitter are just an ad company. They're both ad companies and we are the product, right? So they just want to ensure that we're on these platforms for the longest period of time possible. And what tends to do it is, generating engagement, generating kind of, amplifying anger, amplifying partisanship, amplifying the worst instincts that we have. So I think that's really ultimately at the core of the issue here, is that the problem is that these online spaces, and we're all kind of, especially with the pandemic, right? We all kind of went online. All of these spaces are not built for these types of meaningful interactions. And like, I don't, it's above my pay grade. Like, I don't know how to design them better, right? But I think that's really at the crux of the issue, right? Like, how do we at least transfer some of these norms that exist in a face-to-face interaction, right? How do we ensure that your instinct is not just to kind of dunk on the other person and call them names, etc., right? But how do we ensure that the kinds of interactions that happen in these on these platforms are the kinds of interactions that happen in person, right? Because of the social norms and all the other things, unless you're a psychopath, you're not just going to like insult the other person that you're talking to in our group in a library, right? Most people are just not wired that way. So how do we do that? I don't know, but I think that's really at the crux of it.
Excellent. And then thinking of another institution that I believe we all believe is important is, education at every level. What role do educational institutions, and I include the library, I include K through 12, as well as universities, what roles should we be playing to help with this question of information disorder? Anybody wants to take that?
I actually studied journalism at Colorado State University, and as part of the course work, we are trained in news literacy and kind of how to identify those things for ourselves and as new up and coming journalists. So I think that's really important at the university level, and K through 12, certainly not my expertise, but I imagine that there would be ways to make that part of the base curriculum. But then you're talking about state policy, obviously, when it comes to that. And as far as libraries go, we definitely have a role in providing the news literacy resources for those that seek it out. We can put it on a poster in the library and have the information pamphlets under it. But we do have all that information available, and there are trained librarians that can help with that, but it's kind of the matter of like, how do we bring it to people? I mean, is it a matter of programming with misinformation groups where we come and talk about, what's going on in the community and talk about misinformation? But I think there is a responsibility from an education standpoint, especially as someone who has grown up with social media being a big part of my life and my childhood. It's really important that we include that where we can, outside of even like a journalism specific coursework for somebody that chose to study it.
It's a really good point. Digital literacy at the primary school level makes a lot of sense beyond just this political question. There's a lot of navigating of digital media that deals with mental health and connectivity and very important topics that are both social as well as personal. So that's a good idea. David, do you have thoughts on the university's role here?
Well, I definitely would agree that we need to have more media literacy education. I mean, of course, we do it in JMC. And I think the state of Colorado has made some movement toward trying to put some of that education into the K through 12 kind of education, public education system. But I mean, I don't know that we've seen a lot of the curriculum that would be used in that yet. It's kind of funny. It's whenever I talk about media literacy with my undergrads, I get one of two responses, either like the idea that, absolutely, we need this, we need to learn it, or like this immediate kind of assumption that like, that is for my crazy aunt on Facebook who reposts the memes and the crap that I ignore, and like trying to get past the idea that like the younger generation, there's this dual role of both being more digitally native to understand the concepts and approaching it in a different manner, but also understanding that they can also be susceptible or vulnerable to the kinds of problems or issues, but they might not be in the most blatant manner. Like everybody has that one person on Facebook, and that can always be our easy approach to try to dismiss this idea of the third party effect, that like, oh, well, I'm immune to being deceived or to being manipulated that way. So, I mean, like overcoming some of those problems have been interesting challenges, I guess, but I think absolutely educational system should be a vital part of trying to educate people about how to have these conversations. And then maybe it means branching out and having more of these attempts to try and practice or play around with these ideas in the classroom, as opposed to just like as a kind of foreign idea that you run into on the internet. Maybe we actually try to get them to engage in the kinds of practices we're talking about in real kind of contexts, could be great examples of trying to push them to be reflexive, open-minded, critical thinkers, and respectful. God forbid that they learn respect in some manner so that they're not the people that Dom is concerned about yelling and screaming at each other on the internet, but being nice to each other's face, which of course is the reality. But yeah, maybe kind of those two different dual roles would be really helpful.
Excellent. Yeah, Sylvia, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, in addition to media literacy, which I completely agree is a critical aspect of, continue to building a pipeline, of informed, right, consumers of news, from, younger ages and into adulthood. I think there's also something to be said about tapping into the power of community storytellers, right? Like individuals who hold already the trust of communities and influence, and learning to leverage, that kind of power within community, right? Like, is there a training that could be provided that is accessible to community storytellers? Again, to, continue to diversify newsrooms, to continue to bring diverse perspectives into the news and information ecosystem. And then, also learning to leverage these platforms, such as social media as a vehicle for news and reliable information, flooding the system with, news and reliable information that is created, by people who hold already the trust of communities, and having the resources and the training provided to them so that they can access, this field, this ecosystem.
Yeah, that's really great. And it makes me think about the project that we're working on right now too, which is one of the goals of Deliberative Journalism Project is to try to get as many community stakeholders involved as possible in dealing with this. And we put a lot of emphasis on newsrooms. I do want to ask what you think Newsroom's role is in this. I know it's an important part of it, but I guess I just want to add an element of a question to that. And I think, Sylvia, you just touched on it, which is, what community help do you think newsrooms need to be effective at the local level, especially in making sure that our information ecosystem is healthy and is representative of a pluralistic representation of both ideas and identities. We know newsrooms can't do this all on their own, especially now, but they probably never could have. So what could newsrooms use to help them do that kind of work?
I would say learning how information moves, within and across communities, right? I think many times there are ways that are, on social media, online, more informal, through which critical and non-critical information moves from one individual community member to another. And that becomes really the most reliable way in which people get their news, and so I think for newsrooms to be able to tap into that network that already exists and being able to leverage or just contribute to that in a way that is helpful would be a good way to act in partnership with communities.
Excellent. Rebecca, do you have thoughts on this too? What kind of help could you use? Because we know that you are at the front line of this many times.
Pardon me, forgive me. I was answering some questions in the Q&A. What could I use to help?
In terms of community institutions or even individuals, people's roles that would help you help the community of Fort Collins have a healthy information ecosystem.
Yeah. I mean, I always think, having more people with diverse experiences and viewpoints, kind of all in one place talking about it is always a good thing. Holding each other accountable. So, you know, for us to develop relationships with groups in our community who, you know, we historically haven't engaged with very well, that's going to help us understand and, you know, get more information from them to explain where they're coming from. I really do. I just think diversity of thought and having good relationships with those people beforehand, so you can always go back to them and kind of run something by them and be like, well, what do you think of this? What do you make of this? And then that can show up in your reporting, you know, all of that really deep thought that as a newsroom, we may not have ourselves. I mean, we don't have that diversity in our newsroom. So.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Anybody else have thoughts about this? Supporting your local newsroom is, I think, a fairly new concept. At least it is for me, that we would reach out to community institutions and ask for help to do the work that we're trying to do. Other stakeholders that anybody can think of, or other solutions around that we should be considering, both as human beings in a community, but also as the Deliberative Journalism Project.
You know, this is kind of separate from the concept of misinformation that we've been talking about at large, but when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think Fort Collins has a lot of initiatives at a government and institution level to try and implement those things. We are doing a lot of work surrounding making our institution more equitable and diverse, both from a staff and a public side, and did a big survey, I think 4 months ago, where we collected over 25,000 community members' feedbacks on what they would like to see in the library in an effort to try and make voices that aren't always heard as well more prevalent. And we've talked about it a lot in this panel about how important it is to have diversity in newsrooms. And I think we'd all agree that's very important to getting the broadest range of voices in any given community.
Excellent. So I'll just mention real quickly something we're trying with the Coloradoan in the fall. We actually are starting a class called the Deliberative Journalism class, in which we'll have both journalism students as well as students from, I believe we have one from international relations, somebody from sociology, people from communication studies, from many different kinds of disciplines as well. We're going to try to build a newsroom here on campus that will support newsrooms in our community in doing this deliberative action around comments, as well as reaching out to people in the community who are largely either underrepresented or misrepresented sometimes in the community. So we're going to try to do things like use flyers and canvass neighborhoods, specific neighborhoods that maybe don't have access to the media or don't use it as a part of their daily routine, to see if we can get thoughts from communities that are often underrepresented in our community. And so we'll report back on that as we go along. Also, I just wanted to make sure, Martine, is there anything else that you would like to share that you want to take a chance at the beginning that people should know before we sign off?
Yeah. One of the main things I missed at the beginning was introducing you, right? So we didn't get that started.
That was no big deal.
No, it's been wonderful listening at all of y'all kind of engaging this. As I mentioned earlier, I'll post a link as well. All these links that people have been sharing, I've just been putting on a Google Doc. So I have that link if people want to kind of explore a little bit more, some of the research and some of the books of the different academics on here and some of the other projects. I also just posted a link. Sylvia mentioned this earlier, the project with the Co-Lab and the Institute for Science and Policy and the CPD, continuing this conversation on misinformation. They have a survey out right now, so we'd love for people to engage that survey, give a little bit more feedback, particularly after this conversation, as we continue to understand that. Part of that project, if people are familiar with the CPD, we create these discussion guides, we create these tools to help people have these conversations. So we'll be developing a couple of a viewpoints document, eventually probably more of a typical deliberative discussion guide based on what we're hearing from all these surveys and from this discussion. And then we'll be sharing that as a tool for other communities to do with that, the focus of today of how can a local community really build the resources to do this kind of work. So yeah, I appreciate everyone's participation today.
Yeah, and I'll just thank the panel for all your expertise and interesting insights, and just such a good learning experience to hear so many perspectives on how to address this wicked problem. I think it gives me a little bit of hope, which as a longtime journalist is nearly a miracle. So thank you all for all that you brought to the conversation today, and I'll let Martine sign us off.
Yeah, I just popped my email in the chat too. If you RSVP, we have your email. We were recording this, so we'll send out the recording. We'll put it out on our social media as well if you think others may be interested in it. So feel free to share this with others. But other than that, I appreciate everyone's time and hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.